Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. I will be setting up an Instagram account for the podcast this week. As well as promoting new episodes on there, I'll also be posting other content about politics or history that I find interesting. The name of the account will be Tom Lehman Podcast, as I think The Hated and the Dead is unlikely to meet the community guidelines for Instagram usernames. It would be great if all of you on Instagram could follow the page and direct your own followers to do the same. Today's episode is about French journalist turned politician Éric Zemmour. Over the last 3 months, Monsieur Zemmour has attracted considerable attention in European media for his hard right stances on immigration, Islam and secularism. He is now polling somewhere between 12 and 18% for the French presidential election, due to take place in April. Whilst Zemmour's rise is often considered remarkable, in reality his success is only the latest in a long line of far-right French politicians, in the context of a political system that has been drifting rightwards for decades. It is this drift that dominates the conversation you're about to hear. My guest for today is Aurelien Mondon, an expert in far-right European politics and lecturer in politics at the University of Bath. We discuss the rise of C News, the so-called French Fox News, Zemmour's career as a journalist, why secularism and anti-Islamic politics have such a stronghold in the French Republic, and, of course, whether Zemmour has a chance of defeating President Emmanuel Macron in April's election. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Éric Zemmour. Aurelien, I'm going to try and not introduce you in my fairly broken French, but welcome nonetheless. You're my first guest of 2022. I do hope you had a good Christmas and New Year.
Yeah, it was very restful actually. I managed to switch off, which is rare in academia. So so that was good.
Great. Éric Zemmour is probably the most notable newcomer to European politics I can think of in the last 6 months or so. It's almost become a cliche to say that everyone's talking about him. Whether anyone's saying anything interesting about him is a different matter. Bearing in mind you were talking to obviously a mostly non-French audience, what do you think is important to know about him?
Well, that's a big question, and I think it's a big question not just for an audience that's outside of France, but actually for a lot of French people who may not quite understand where Zemmour is coming from. I think there's a mistake that's fairly commonly made about Zemmour, is to see him as extraordinary and as a one-man show in a way. And I think it is a mistake, because if you look actually at the trajectory of French politics over the last 20, 30, 40 years even, Zemmour is a logical conclusion to this trajectory in a way. He's not an aberration. He's not extraordinary. He's not particularly clever himself in any way. And I think that's a mistake we tend to make, not just in France, but I think that's a mistake we tend to make a lot when we look at the far right. We tend to look at the far right as this aberration, but we also tend to look at the far right and think about leaders, about individuals, and all of these kind of things. And we tend to forget not just about what's behind them on the far right, but also what's around them in the mainstream, in the media, in academia to some extent, and all kind of the whole kind of system that legitimizes these ideas and allow them to kind of come back to the center of politics. You know, ideas that were not so long ago taboos, ideas that were not so long ago relegated to the kind of margins of society, of politics, and so on and so forth, and that have now made a comeback. And these ideas haven't made a comeback on their own. They haven't made a comeback just because people want to hear them. They've made a comeback because they've been allowed to by the people who have a better access to public discourse, if you want. And so I think we need to really understand Zemmour in this kind of context, in this long context of the mainstreaming of far-right politics in France, which started in the 1980s with a few, or even 70s, we could say, with a few intellectuals who started rethinking how to make, far-right politics come back to the mainstream. then all the way through the early days of Jean-Marie Le Pen and the Front National, to the development of the Front National, to the 2002 presidential election when Jean-Marie Le Pen gets to the second round, and a complete misreading of the situation at the time in France, which then leads to further normalization of the far right, which leads to Nicolas Sarkozy, who pushed a very far right discourse during his campaign and his presidency between 2007 and 2012, which then leads to far right ideas being front and center in public discourse, which of course has an impact on the media. The media has an impact on politics. Politics has an impact on the media. And Zemmour is part of that. Zemmour has been part of that for a very long time. He starts as a journalist in the right-wing media. Is given many platforms from very, very early on. His ideas are extremely extreme. Is far beyond Le Pen, even to some extent, in many ways, and he doesn't hide the extremism.
Okay, so if we discuss Zemmour's background a bit more, then Aurelien, he was born just outside Paris in 1958. He's 63. He's the son of Algerian Jewish immigrants, which is quite an interesting thing about him, which I want to talk about in more detail later on in the interview. Do we know much about his early life? Was his upbringing comfortable? Was it particularly religious? And I suppose, most importantly, was it a political upbringing?
Well, to be honest, I don't really know much about his upbringing, and I try, when in my research, I try not to necessarily look into this, because again, I think it is important to remove politics and the political trajectory and the political impact of these kind of people from the personal in many ways. And I think it would be probably unhelpful to justify his trajectory and where is that now, just based on how he grew up, and either finding him excuses or finding ways to actually make him look worse. I think he needs to be judged in a way based on what he's saying now and what he's been saying in the last 20 years or something like that. But okay. More than that, I think what I'm interested in is not so much whether he needs to be judged or not and whether he's good or bad, but the impact is having on French society and French politics, really. He's
a journalist by trade, as you said. He's never been elected to public office before. I'm assuming that his lack of political experience, like so many populists of recent times, only makes him more attractive to the people who already like him. But when did he first become a kind of household name as a journalist? Was there something that he did, something that he wrote, something that he said, which made him into a recognized figure?
Well, he's been interested in politics for a very long time. So even though he's not a politician by trade, he's been involved in politics, in shaping discourse, in shaping the political agenda for a very long time. And he's been a prominent journalist in the right-wing press for a long time. So he's been a household name for some people for quite a while now, publishing for Le Figaro, for example, and various other right-wing outlets. He's been on TV for quite a long time as well, and not just on right-wing TV, but even on liberal shows, for example, that really helped him kind of gain more legitimacy and more space in the French media. And it's quite interesting that some of the kind of more liberal personas in the French media who invited him at first to be a bit like the kind of right-wing kind of conservative extremist in a way, as a bit of to kind of mock him or to make fun of him. They ended up regretting it because they realized that actually they were playing right into his hands, really, which I think is fascinating. But he really became a household name when CNews really became the news channel that it is now. A lot of people are comparing it to Fox News in the US. I think it's a bit more complicated than that because the French media ecosystem is very different to the American one. But I think, we haven't had in France, it's true, a TV channel that has been as political as CNews is, and as particularly right-wing and extreme right-wing as CNews is. And that's when he became really the kind of centerpiece of CNews. So it doesn't mean that CNews is just him, of course, but it seems that CNews kind of is built for his ideas or for ideas that he embraces himself. And so there's a lot of kind of other journalists in CNews which I would have never expected to be on mainstream TV. And today they have these platforms, which is quite incredible. So that's really when he becomes a household name and when he became known by everyone. But what I think is fascinating with Zemmour again is that his extremism is just beyond belief, and it's always been like that, and he's never hidden it. If you think from the time that he released his first book in 2006 called Le Premier Sexe, The First Sex, which is of course a dig at Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote the famous The Second Sex, kind of great feminist kind of book, and in 2006, when this book comes out, it's a 100-page book, or it's really short. Anyone could read it. It's not written in any kind of like jargony way. It's not an academic book in any way, shape, or form. And that book is incredibly violent, incredibly. It's deeply racist, it's deeply homophobic, and it's deeply sexist. It's full of conspiracy theories, which are honestly mind-blowing. Like I was talking to students about it a few weeks ago, just before the end of the semester, in one of my last lectures, and they were shocked. I mean, that these kind of things could be published, and not only that this kind of thing could be published, but that it could be published by a fairly mainstream press, by a fairly mainstream journalist, and that no one kind of raises an eyebrow. But he keeps getting invited, and I think that's fascinating. The fact that actually he's managed to survive for so long, saying things in such a kind of open way, where Marine Le Pen wouldn't have dared, if you want, for example. She might feel the same, but she wouldn't say it.
I suppose that to some extent, the reason that he's got away with saying a lot of these things is that, as you said at the beginning, he doesn't really exist in a vacuum. French politics has actually been moving to the right for quite a long time now. If we leave Zemmour for a second and take a look at the political environment of the right more generally, he's kind of the new kid on the block, as you said, and the hard right in your country is best associated, really, or was best associated with the Front National and with the Le Pen family. Can you tell us a little bit about the Front National's history, what their traditional platform was, and introduce the figure of Marine Le Pen, who's obviously quite an important person in this story?
Yeah, the Front National, I mean, is really the far-right party in France, and has been for almost 50 years now. So Front National is created in the early 1970s. It's created it's an alliance, if you want, that's why it's called a front. It's an alliance of the kind of neo-fascists who are really at the margins of politics in France. So hardcore neo-fascists with the more kind of extreme right nationalists, but not quite as far as neo-fascism. It's a tiny alliance at first. It's worth nothing electorally. The first president of the Front National is Jean-Marie Le Pen, not because he's actually at the origin of this kind of front, at this origin of this gathering, but because he seems to be the most moderate person, the most kind of palatable person. It's worth noting that at the time, Jean-Marie Le Pen was a defender of the Vichy regime, which collaborated with the Nazis. That he had participated in various kind of very extreme right campaigns and so on. So he was very extreme candidate, and yet he was the most palatable at the start of the Front National. For the first 10 years, the Front National does absolutely nothing. And electorally, they were absolutely nothing. In 1981, they can't even run for the presidency because Le Pen can't even get the 500 signatures that are needed to be able to run for a presidential campaign. 500 signatures from mayors or from people, for notables in France, if you want. But then came the 1980s, and I think that's where it's so important to understand the rise of the far right, not just in France, but across the globe, really, in a broader context, because Jean-Marie Le Pen and the Front National could have never gained any traction if it wasn't for the help of mainstream forces. What happens in the 1980s is in 1981, François Mitterrand is elected as president of France. He is a socialist president. His program is actually very radical. To give you an idea, it's actually far more radical than Corbyn's program, for example. And so it's kind of this wave of kind of optimism on the left. But in the early 1980s, 1982, 83, there is a big recession, and that forces, or at least that's what Mitterrand would have argued, it forces him to push austerity policies, and so therefore he turns from a very radical left-wing program to a very kind of right-wing austerity platform. And at this stage, he starts losing a lot of support, and is worried that the right will get into power. And so what he tries to do is to split the right. And to split the right, what he does is give a big platform on public television and on the public media to Jean-Marie Le Pen, in a hope that actually Jean-Marie Le Pen will be able to take a chunk of the vote from the right, which will prevent the right from actually getting a majority in the upcoming parliamentary elections. And so what happens is, for the first time, Jean-Marie Le Pen is right front and center on the public media. And that's when he starts kind of gaining some attention and starting to make some gains electorally. And that leads us to 1988, which is the next presidential elections. That's when Jean-Marie Le Pen gets around 15% of the vote all of a sudden. So from 1981, where he can't even run because he doesn't even get enough support to run, which is very basic support, to 1988, where he gets 15% of the vote in the biggest election in France. Then there's a few kind of more breaks. At this stage, the party also develops. This is the start of really the kind of normalization of the party, what is called the de-demonization, the de-demonization of the party. So, you kind of the sanitization of the party, you remove the obvious racism, you remove the hardcore racist, and you try to kind of couch it in more cultural racist terms, which are obviously less easy to debunk and so on. And in 1995, Jean-Marie Le Pen gets again 15% of the vote. At this stage, in the 14 years between 81 and 95, his ideas are also borrowed by many prominent mainstream politicians, both on the right and on the left, talking about immigration a lot at first, but also increasingly from the late 1980s, talking about Islam as a threat to the Republic. This is when the French media, the French people, the French elite discover Islam in a way in France, because it's not like, of course, there haven't been any Muslim people in France. There's been Muslim people for a very long time, but they didn't seem to be worthwhile as a political football until then. But at this stage, when, the children of the people who helped rebuild France, who came to France from the former colonies and helped rebuild France, their children are at school, and some of them are wearing hijabs. And that's bothering absolutely no one at the time, but it becomes a political football. And some public intellectuals in particular kind of latch onto this, and then some politicians latch onto this. And that's what we call the hijab affairs in France, and what will lead France towards banning hijabs in school, then towards banning the burqa in the streets, and various other kind of liberticidal laws that have been passed ever since. But we really get to a turning point in 2002, the presidential election of 2002, when Jean-Marie Le Pen reaches the second round. So to reach the second round of a presidential election in France, you need to finish in the top two. So you have a first round with as many candidates as you can, really, that can get the 500 signatures I talked about. And then to get to the second round, where you need the majority of the vote between the two runner-ups, but you need to finish in the top two in the first round. And what was expected was that the center-left and the center-right, Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin, who were in a cohabitation, what's called cohabitation in France at the time. So president was Jacques Chirac, right-wing. Prime minister was Lionel Jospin, left-wing or center-left. And they were just cohabiting in power at the time. And what everyone expected was it would be them two in the second round, as has always been the case, center-right, center-left, fighting it off. And they were deeply unpopular. For various reasons, right? First, because we were cohabiting, and so therefore they couldn't be as right-wing or as left-wing as their, electorate wanted them to be. They were not particularly, they were embroiled in corruption scandals. For Chirac, for example, Jospin wasn't particularly charismatic, various other reasons. So people were a bit fed up with the entire system. Things were not working for them anymore. It was the kind of post-political stage as well, convergence, all of these kind of things. Yeah. And so you have the first round with a lot of candidates and with a fed-up electorate. And what happens is, all we talked about after the first round, when Jean-Marie Le Pen gets through, is like, oh my God, the fascists are at the door. This is, we need to beat fascism. Everyone, all the kind of media were plastered with like, we need to vote for Chirac for democracy. So the second round was Jacques Chirac versus Jean-Marie Le Pen. Everyone was like, we need to vote for Jacques Chirac for democracy, for the Republic. Fascists are at the door, blah, blah, blah. This is the rise of fascism. This is terrible. So that's all we talked about. And, this was the first time I voted, right? And I was on the streets demonstrating as well, being very worried that, again, fascism was on the rise. But this was, the end of democracy, and that I had to vote for Jacques Chirac. All the parties, bar one, bar a Trotskyist extreme left party, called for their supporters to vote for Jacques Chirac. So even the other Trotskyist party called for their supporters to vote for a right-wing candidate embroiled in corruption scandals. It's incredible, right? Everyone was so worried about it. Jacques Chirac gets elected by 82% of the vote. Feels like a dictator, right? A dictatorship. What no one talked about was that in 2002, in the first round, Jean-Marie Le Pen stagnates. He does not get any more vote than he got in 95 and that he got in 88, right? He increases a tiny little bit, but the electorate increases as well. So actually, it's more or less, if you look at the size of his vote, it's more or less the same.
So it was the fragmentation of the left that propelled him to the second round?
Well, That, and not just that, though. It's the fragmentation of the left. You're absolutely right. So there's a few small parties, like the Trotskyist parties that I talked about, that get 5% of the vote. There's various other little parties that get, chunks of the vote because people are fed up with the center left. But it's also, perhaps more importantly, the rise of abstention. In 2002, in the first round, as many people abstain as people who will vote for the main parties that have led France for decades. So we have like a massive explosion of abstention. People just switch off completely. But no one talks about that. No one talks about the fragmentation, which is that people want something different. And no one talks about abstention, which is, people want something different or they just fed up with it. All we talk about is the Front National. And that's what will lead the headlines in the next, 2 decades, more or less, and particularly in the 5 years after 2002, all we talked about was the threat of Jean-Marie Le Pen and how to defeat it. And the right will latch onto that and will push a candidate that will be Nicolas Sarkozy, who will claim that he will go and get the Front National voters one by one, that he will make a lot of kind of derogatory statements against the French banlieue, against Islam, about securitization, all of these kind of things. And again, what will be fascinating about Nicolas Sarkozy's rise, campaign, and victory eventually, and presidency, is how he's normalized things that were until then said by other politicians, but they were always careful. They would say something that sounded like it was Front National, but they would be like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean it, blah, blah. Well, Nicolas Sarkozy was like, yeah. And then he becomes candidate, and then he becomes president. And so the things that Jean-Marie Le Pen used to say are now said by the president. And what happens in 2007 is Jean-Marie Le Pen gets absolutely pummeled in the first round. He gets 10% of the vote. And on the eve of the first round, the campaign director for Jean-Marie Le Pen is Marine Le Pen, his daughter. She's not known at the time, or she's not known by anyone who is not particularly interested in politics. And she's asked on TV, and I remember this very, very vividly. She's asked on TV, like, is it the end of the Front National and is it the end of Jean-Marie Le Pen? And she says, well, I don't know if that's the end of the Front National or Jean-Marie Le Pen, but what I know is that it's the victory of her ideas. And it's fascinating, right? Because at that stage, we don't know whether Jean-Marie Le Pen is going to retire, whether he's going to run another campaign or not. And eventually what happens is he doesn't, of course. And Marine Le Pen takes over. And Marine Le Pen is a woman. She's divorced. She's young. She's much more polished. She's much more careful. She doesn't have a baggage that Jean-Marie Le Pen has. And so comes 2012, we have a very normalized Front National candidate. And comes 2017, with the demise of the center left, then we have Marine Le Pen in the second round. And now comes to 2022, we have an extreme right candidate, but he's far more extreme than her.
Well, let's talk about the 2017 election in a bit more detail. And so Le Pen got to the second round of that election. You sort of referenced what that means. It means that she was one of the two most popular candidates in the first round. She made it to the second round against Emmanuel Macron, but she only got, I think, 1 out of every 3 votes, and Macron became president. I mean, it's obviously significant that from 2002, where Jean-Marie Le Pen got, I think, 18% of the vote, to 17, where her daughter gets 33% of the vote. I mean, you can see where this is going. 5 years later, it's 2022 now. Macron is running for re-election. Le Pen is obviously running as well. And now so is Eric Zemmour. What does Zemmour say about the Macron presidency during his rallies? He's trying to get Macron out of office. What are his main criticisms of him?
Well, that's a criticism that he has for absolutely everyone in a way, except the very extreme right. It's the fact it's fascinating if you watch Zemmour's video for launch of his campaign. It ticks all of the boxes of a traditional fascist discourse, and it's. I didn't expect it to be that violent, to be honest. I mean, it's not. I mean, it is kind of violent in the obvious sense of the term, but it's violent in what it kind of echoes in history, and this is very much what it tackles. I mean, Macron is the arch enemy of this kind of politics in a way. Is the bureaucrat, is the person who's a technocrat, who he's elitist. Not that Zemmour isn't, obviously. Well, that's what's quite interesting about fascism in a way and fascist politics. And Macron is the perfect target for these kind of things. But Zemmour has been critical of the people before him as well. He's been critical of Hollande, of course, and has been critical of the centre right as well, who he argues have given up on France and French ideals and things like that. And he talks about the Republic a little, but it's not really the Republic that he's defending. It's a kind of older, more conservative form of France, which really echoes old school nationalism and old school extreme right conceptions of France, which take their lead from Charles Maurras of the Action Française in the late 19th, early 20th century, from Barrès, and it's honestly, it's not something I would have expected would come back to the mainstream. I always expected it to play a role in on the margins, and this is something that we started seeing a little bit rising during Nicolas Sarkozy's presidency. Actually, he was surrounded by a few people who had these kind of ideas, people who even tapped into the old French extreme right with links to even royalism, the monarchy, bringing by the monarchy, which sounds completely mad in France, right? But some of these people actually believe this would be the way forward. I'm not saying Zemmour does necessarily, but there's this. He's part of this kind of circles, and this is why Zemmour is also in cahoots with the kind of the people on the extreme right who have felt kind of left out by the new Front National or the new Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen. As Marine Le Pen tries to normalize the party, she tries to move away from the ultra-Catholics, for example, as she's trying to tap into laicite, into secularism, because tapping into laicite and secularism allows her to be Islamophobic without seeming so, right? It's much more difficult for her to be Islamophobic if she's in cahoots with the ultra-Catholics that her father was linked with for a very long time. Ultra-Catholic groups were linked to the Front National from the beginning, and she's managed to kind of push them away so that she could tap into the laicite trope, which allows her to be potentially more racist. And all these people who felt left out by Marine Le Pen, the ultra-Catholics, the more kind of openly racist groups, the more extreme right group, even her niece, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, who felt that Marine Le Pen wasn't going far enough. All of these people find a room in Eric Zemmour's campaign and in Eric Zemmour's ideas, because he's, even though he still doesn't go as far as some of them would go, he still taps into it far more openly than Marine Le Pen would. So, for example, Zemmour doesn't talk openly about the Great Replacement theory, but he's not far off. And CNews, which is very much his own platform nowadays, invites people like Jean-Yves Camus, not Jean-Yves Camus, sorry, Renaud Camus. Jean-Yves Camus is a researcher of the far right in France. So I shouldn't compare them. But yeah, Renaud Camus is invited on CNews, which is absolutely mad against CNews, being of course it's the French Fox News, but it's still a mainstream platform. And Renaud Camus is, the kind of person who theorized the Great Replacement, which led to, various terrorist attacks and so on and so forth. And all of these kind of people are feeling emboldened by Zemmour. And Zemmour is feeling emboldened by the fact that Marine Le Pen managed to get so far in the past as well.
So, I've sort of read, I'm not completely sure about this, but I've read that Marine Le Pen, especially since she lost in 2017, has gone a long way to kind of moderating her image and her platform. She's changed the name from the Front National to Rassemblement National. I'm not a French speaker, so I don't know whether that kind of moderates her platform in and of itself. But she's also, for example, recently she said that she would keep France in the Euro, she'd keep France in the Schengen area. She's very much clearly trying to move her image towards the kind of centre of politics. Even further towards the centre of politics. That, from what you're saying, it sounds as if that has kind of opened up this flank on the right for somebody to fill, and obviously that person is Eric Zemmour. The thing that Zemmour talks most about, we've kind of skirted around his message a lot, but let's get into it. The thing that he talks about most is Islam and Islamic immigration. What does Zemmour claim about the relationship between Islam and the French state?
Well, for him, Islam is incompatible with the French state, and that's his main message in a way, but that's his main outward message, let's say, but it's not necessarily the core of his message. And I think, one of the things that I keep going back to is his first book, really, Le Premier Sexe, because I think Zemmour is not just against Islam. For him, Islam is the last kind of stage in the downfall of the French nation. So, and it all starts for Zemmour. It all starts, and that's why he's a traditional kind of French extreme right, because really it's the anti-revolutionary agenda that comes back that comes back in 2022, which is absolutely mad. If you read Le Premier Sexe, and if you read then his following books as well, and if you look at his speeches in detail as well, it always comes back to these kind of anti-revolutionary, anti-enlightenment principles in many ways. So for Zemmour, in the biggest criticism in Le Premier Sexe is that the problem is women in a way. We gave rights to women, and women turned France into a feminized country, and women in cahoots with LGBTQ communities have turned the French men into French women, and because of that, then Muslim men who are real viral people have come and they've taken over France. So, you can see how the sexism, the homophobia, and the racism in it, like the Orientalism, the sheer Orientalism in his thinking is incredible. And of course, it's all about conspiracy theories as well. And these conspiracy theories then also allow him to tap into various anti-Semitic tropes, which is quite interesting, of course, because as you said at the beginning, he is Jewish himself, and he uses that to prevent being attacked for being anti-Semitic himself. But a lot of the conspiracy theories he falls into, a lot of the tropes he falls into are deeply anti-Semitic as well. And what's quite incredible is that, even though Islam sells in France, because being Islamophobic in France is incredibly mainstream nowadays. It's very easy to be Islamophobic, and no one will tell you not to be. And in fact, it's when you're not Islamophobic that you get attacked, and you're called an Islamo-leftist, for example, or you get really, pushed out of the mainstream media or thought of as a radical. And so he uses his Islamophobia as a centerpiece because it sells and because everyone agrees with it, and none of the other kind of politicians would actually criticize him on that, because they've been saying more or less the same thing, maybe in less extreme ways. But then he uses that to then push over ideas that are incredibly reactionary and incredibly conservative, and even though it tones down some of these more problematic or more extreme ideas, particularly against women, and he's tried recently to be a bit more careful with that. You don't have to kind of scratch very far to find, the incredibly violent sexism of his politics. And what shocks me still to this day is that he's not held accountable on it. On his sexism, on his homophobia, and that's fascinating for me, because not because it's worse than his Islamophobia. I think it's, all three are just as bad, and his racism. Like, I think all of these are equally terrible, and all of these should be equally denounced. But for a very long time, the way Islamophobia became mainstream in France and in other countries as well was on the basis of what has been called femo-nationalism and homo-nationalism. From femo-nationalism developed by Sarah Faris, and homo-nationalism by Jasbir Puar, which is the idea that you can justify your Islamophobia by saying that you're defending the rights of women, or you're defending the rights of LGBTQ communities, right? So it's like, well, we don't like Islam and Muslims because they're against women or they're against LGBTQ people. Of course, it's deeply racist as an argument, because it homogenizes huge populations and racializes them. But it worked in the mainstream discourse, because we were like, oh well, if it's for women's rights, or if it's for LGBTQ rights, then that's okay. It's sexism over racism and vice versa, right? But Zemmour does away with that. And you know what? He's equally sexist and racist and homophobic, and no one cares.
He wrote this book, The French Suicide, in 2014, which lays out many of his ideas about Islam. But it's not just him, is it? I mean, the notion that Muslims are kind of taking over France, as you said, is a very widespread view in your country now. You have other authors and journalists writing books about this topic. I'm thinking about, the bestseller Soumission by Michel Houellebecq. I saw a British Times article recently that said that 1 in 3 French people believe that Islam is taking over the country, person by person and institution by institution. Within the UK, there are certainly tensions between the state and Muslim communities, and between certain parts of the native population and Muslim communities. But in France, that tension seems to be at a fever pitch now that it isn't at here. Not to say that Britain doesn't have a problem with this, it does, but it seems that the entire French system is almost in a state of moral panic about this supposed issue. Why has Islam become such a big political issue in France to the extent that a guy can run a presidential campaign almost entirely on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Things are not good here, and Islamophobia is incredibly widespread in the UK and in UK politics. And you don't have to look very far to see the comments of Boris Johnson and so on. But it's nowhere near where it's at in France and how accepted it is in France. And again, I think that's why you need again to look at broader contexts, right, and the broader historical and political context. And France. I mean, really, what happens with France and Islam is absolutely fascinating when you try to understand the way hegemony works almost, and the way meanings are constructed and moral panics are constructed, as you said. So, I mean, France always had a very interesting kind of history with regard to religion from the French Revolution in 1789. Not so much from 1789, but more from 1792 onwards, during the period of the Terror, where there was a really big crackdown on religion and so on. But it's gone on and off, right? So there's the French Revolution, then there's Napoleon who makes peace with religion, blah blah blah, and then for the whole of kind of the 19th century, there's kind of this back and forth, and then comes the late 19th century and early 20th century that leads to the law of 1905, which is often quoted by many politicians to justify their Islamophobia, which is the law of separation of church and state. This law was incredibly moderate at the time. The aim of the law was to remove the power of the Catholic Church from political interference in a way. The Catholic Church was incredibly powerful at the time in France, had a lot of power on shaping French politics. And what the Republicans wanted was to make sure that the Republic became the hegemony, that people, when they thought about France, they thought of the Republic first, and then if they wanted to think about Catholicism, that came second. And so they came up with this law, which was very moderate, which really was about preventing political interference of organized religion, if you want. But it was very much, in the law, if you go back to the text, it was very much about protecting individual liberties. So if people wanted to have a religion, great. If people wanted not to have a religion, great. They should be protected as much. And there is an article in that law that says, whether you force someone to have a religion or whether you force someone not to have a religion, you will be punished by law. And again, that's fascinating because nowadays we force people not to wear a hijab, for example, which is against the principle of that law of 1905. So this is the birth of laicity in a way, if you want. Or this is the official birth of laicity, of secularism in France, 1905. Then for a very long time, no one really talks about it, or it's not necessarily in the political, agenda. But then it comes back really in the 70s when there are discussions about abortion in France, and this is when they bring back the concept of laicity as a progressive concept, where again. The state will say, well, the principle of laicity here is the most important one. Therefore, religious pressure should not abide, and women should have a choice themselves as individuals to decide whether they want an abortion or not, and for whatever reason, whether it's for religious reason or anything like that. That's what's going to decide it. It's going to be individual choice. But then you fast forward 10 or 15 years and you get to the late 80s and you get to that kind of post-politic stage of, that I've talked about before. And cynical politicians are looking for political footballs, right? And intellectuals are looking to bring back some kind of reactionary concepts. And that's when they, as I said, they discovered Islam almost. And they started targeting in particular, young girls who decide to wear a hijab at school. Of course, never asking these girls why they wear a hijab, never asking them whether they were forced to, whether they decided to, whether it was cultural, whether it was religious, whether it was their own choice or their parents or their brothers or anything like that. And they portray very few cases of girls wearing a hijab at school as this kind of threat to the French Republic. And that makes the news. And it becomes increasingly more prominent. And you get these kind of philosophers and public intellectuals. I mean, philosophers in France are very different to the way philosophers are regarded in the UK. Philosophers in France less so nowadays, but they tended, or public intellectuals tended to play a big role in French media and in French politics. And these people, are in magazines just saying that, in France we've had equality between men and women for a long time, and the only problem that we have to solve is Islam, really, because Muslim men and Muslim brothers and Muslim uncles and fathers are just sexist people, and we need to free Muslim women, which is, of course, already incredibly racist, but that will sell, and you can imagine how it would sell, in the French psyche of being, the country of the Enlightenment, the country of equality, liberty, fraternity, all these kind of things, and people buy into that, and that leads to this kind of really strong focus on that moral panic about Islam in France, which leads in 2016, some colleagues did a survey across the world, actually, about perception, right? And they just asked people lots of questions about various kinds of perception, and one of them was about Islam. The survey is called "The Perils of Perception," and one of them was about Islam, and they asked people, according to you, out of 100 people, how many are Muslim in France, in the UK? And in most countries, to be honest, in most Western countries, people exaggerated the numbers. But in France, people on average said 31%, while the reality is 8%, which is mad, right?
Yeah, that's insane.
Yeah, and in 2016, they're asked, so the same people are asked, and according to you, in 2020, so 4 years later, how many Muslim people will there be out of 100%? And people said 40%. So a 9% increase, which is already mad, more than there are Muslim people in France, they said would increase within 4 years. So they expected that by 2020, 4 out of 10 French people would be Muslim. The same goes with immigration as well. There's an exaggeration, but that's really the biggest exaggeration that you see in this survey. At the same time, in 2016, when French people were asked, according to you, is Islam a threat to the Republic? 71% of respondents said that it was. Again, fascinating, right? So just imagine, right? You have people who think that you have almost a third of the population that Muslim, but it's increasing incredibly rapidly, and that their religion is a threat to the Republic. So just imagine the disconnect from reality. And just imagine how that might shape the way you're going to vote, the way you're going to think about politics, not necessarily the way you're going to behave in your day-to-day life. I'm not saying that necessarily people will be automatically Islamophobic, in the streets and so on, even though, of course, Islamophobic attacks, are quite common and so on. But it's not necessarily how people will act in their day-to-day life, but the way they will think about politics, the way they will think about priorities, the way they will think about their main concerns when it comes to voting, and how they will shift in a way. And this is something that I looked at in my research recently, and how this kind of disconnect between how you feel about your day-to-day life and how you feel about your national life, in a way, the life that you think about when you go to the voting booth, how that justifies then certain discourses from the elite, how that then justifies certain actions from the elite, certain kind of policies, certain campaigns and things like that, and how then these campaigns and policies and actions are blamed onto the people again in some kind of vicious circle, which is that, we talk a lot about Islam in the media, in politics. When people think about Islam a lot in the media, in politics, in a very, very exaggerated way, then they vote according to this, and then the politicians are like, well, we need to talk more about Islam and all of these kind of things. And then you get the media, even the liberal media, who are like, Islam is a taboo, we can't talk about Islam, we can't say anything anymore about Islam. And it's insane. It's all French media politicians talk about. It's Islam. It's all we've been talking about for 30 years almost. And of course, when we talk about Islam, and that's fascinating, because that was the follow-up question to this survey, The Perils of Perception. They asked follow-up questions about it. And, when they said, when we say the word immigrant, or when we say the word Muslim, what do you think about? And people think about negative things, of course. When British people thought about the word immigrant, they didn't think about someone like me. I'm not an immigrant, according to most British people, right? Or maybe nowadays I am after Brexit, but I didn't used to be, right, in 2016. What they thought about were, the swarms of people that you see on Nigel Farage's poster, for example. And in France it's the same. When people think about Muslim people, they don't think about their neighbor, they don't think about the nurse, they don't think about the teacher, they don't think about, the friend. They think about, the terrorist. And again, you can see the kind of hyping of all of that. And as if you needed any more than that, then you have, of course, the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015 that take place. That again, not only shock, well, I mean, quite rightfully shock France, because it's awful, and journalists should never, should never suffer any kind of violence for publishing whatever they want, whatever they choose to, no matter how problematic it is. But it also then is hijacked by reactionary forces, and it becomes almost a duty to be Islamophobic. If you're not Islamophobic, then you're not really, you're justifying the attacks almost. And it's quite incredible how pervasive that has become, because even on the left nowadays, less so, because now, we're 5-6 years later, but more than that, 7 years later. But the few years after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, even on the left, it was almost compulsory to be "Je suis Charlie," regardless of how problematic that statement was, and how that statement actually completely removed any kind of critical thinking from the state of things. And so I'm incredibly pessimistic about the state of things in France when it comes to Islamophobia, unfortunately.
I want to use the last 10 minutes of our time together to discuss the upcoming election. Zemmour is running now officially. I guess quite an important question to ask before the end of the interview is he going to win?
No, I don't think he will win. Look, you say he's running, but he's actually not running yet. He said he will be running, but he hasn't got his signatures yet. It's worth saying that getting the signatures is not easy. In 2017, Marine Le Pen just scraped through. She got 520 signatures or something like that. And
she has a party machine behind her, right?
Exactly. She has a party machine. She has various people who actually are part of the party who can give her the signatures, various mayors and things like that, and councillors and so on. So, there's a limited pool, and it's not easy because it's a public thing, right? So if you give your signature to Zemmour, your name will come out. So that's why for a very long time, Le Pen and Jean-Marie Le Pen in particular, used that to his advantage, saying, "Oh, I don't know if I'm going to get the 500 signature. This is not democracy. This is shocking. I'm worth 15% of the electorate, and I might not be able to run." So, I could imagine Zemmour doing the same if he doesn't get the signatures, for example. But he's not running officially yet.
Could actually be really good for him if he doesn't.
Absolutely, yeah. And it could even be better than running, because I think if he runs. Look, it's too early to make any kind of predictions about the results, but you can already see that on the right, it's incredibly crowded. You've got Eric Zemmour, who is the most far right. Then you've got various little candidates that tap into conspiracy theories that will get a handful of votes. Then you get Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, who got 5% in the last election, who is, let's say, between the right and the far right, who is the only candidate in the last election who called to vote for Marine Le Pen in the second round. Then you have Marine Le Pen, of course. You have Philippot as well, the former number 2 of Marine Le Pen. You have Valérie Pécresse, who is very right-wing as well, the candidate of Les Républicains. You have Macron, who's been tapping a lot into Islamophobia during his and security and securitization during his presidency as well. So the right wing of politics is incredibly crowded. Zemmour is also very, very divisive, right? And I think his pool of voters is very limited. And in fact, I was quite surprised that he ended up running. I thought he would just be dragging it on, and then play the role of kingmaker almost. Be at the end like, no, I'm not running. Actually, I will just put pressure where it's due, whatever. I think it's quite a risk that he's running in the end, and because if he does poorly, it'll be hard for him to kind of really have the impact he could have had, I think, if he had not run and just stayed out as a kingmaker, as I said. So it'll be interesting. But look, one of the problems I think that we'll be facing in this election is that regardless of how well Zemmour does, he will shape the agenda.
Yeah.
And that's what matters, right? Like, for example, there was no way Marine Le Pen would have won in the last election in 2017. And I don't think she will win this time around again. Like, mathematically, it seems really, really improbable that she could get enough vote. And it's worth remembering that when she got 30% of the vote in 2017, it was with massive abstention as well, and against a candidate that was deeply unpopular. Macron has never been very popular as a candidate. People voted for him, not so much for him as they voted against other people, right?
Because he's the anti-candidate, yeah.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this question then. If Zemmour or Le Pen were to win, let's just imagine that one of them does, which sort of French voter will he or she have attracted to the campaign that right now the polls suggest that they're not going to attract. What will have happened? Do you think it will have been that they persuade people to the campaign, or do you think, and I suspect this probably is what you think, that just a large number of left-leaning people will have abstained from voting for Macron?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only way they could win would be with a huge abstention, I think, but a really huge abstention. And I think even though people are getting more and more fed up with the lack of alternatives beyond what they're given as alternatives, which is the right and the far right, even though people are getting more and more fed up with that system that is deeply undemocratic, that pushes forward priorities that are not theirs at all. I'm not saying that very few people buy into this kind of racist priorities that are thrown at them, but they're not their priorities. And when people, I try to be optimistic in a way with these kind of things, right? And it's like, I'm not saying that, obviously mathematically it is possible. I said it's impossible earlier on, but it is possible that they could get elected. But I can't see it happening, because I think there will be always enough people to vote against the far right regardless. And I think also the far right has a small pool of voters. Of course it can increase and it can seem big if abstention is huge, or if the rest of the vote is spread between lots of different candidates. But I think most people in France still remain against these kind of ideas, because the ideas of Zemmour, they're not just against Muslim people, right, and the Muslim communities in France. They're against women. They're against the LGBTQ community. They're against the poor. They're against the vast majority of people in France. And people are not stupid. And I think if Zemmour wins, or if Marine Le Pen wins, I don't think we should blame the people for it. I think we should blame the people who have had access to shaping political discourse in the last 30, 40 years, because it's them who have put these ideas front and center, and it's them who have allowed them to gain traction. Because, if you look at opinion polls, the priorities of people are not immigration, they are not Islam, their priorities are far more mundane in a way. When some opinion polls say that it is Islam or immigration, I think we need to dig a bit deeper and see why they would say that, rather than actually, their children, their parents, their pensions, their employment, all of these kind of things, which is obviously far more obvious.
Yeah, I like that. I think it will be the fault of the mainstream parties. I was thinking earlier before we started, if you look at the three presidents before Macron, you've got Chirac, Sarkozy and Hollande, and all of them were just terrible incumbents and are not considered to have been successful presidents. And I think that people like Le Pen and Zemmour have filled a vacuum, and they've kind of built a career on pretending that they're not part of the establishment that they claim to hate. Very much like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, incidentally.
Absolutely. But I think they've also been useful idiots. Not necessarily idiots, but they've been useful to mainstream parties as well, because they've allowed mainstream parties to spook their electorate without changing tack, without making the radical decisions that are needed to be made today in France to kind of fix a system that is not working for many people anymore. And so they've used the far right as a diversion. And this is what I said earlier. In the early 1980s, when the socialist president used the Front National and Jean-Marie Le Pen to kind of try and divide the right. This is just that cynical, and that's why if you actually posit the far right as the alternative to the status quo, then you justified your place in power simply by the fact that you're not the far right. And this is not what the people want anymore. The people have priorities that are far beyond that. We are facing so many crises in France and in the world that are beyond the far right. There's the climate crisis, of course. There's unemployment has been really high in France for years and years and years. There's the social welfare state that is crumbling, or that is suffering. There's so many issues that need to be resolved in France. And instead we've had that kind of scarecrow on the right, that kind of, this idea that if you don't vote for Chirac, for Sarkozy, for Hollande, for Mitterrand, then you'll get the far right. And it's been, I'm sorry, but it was bullshit for most of the time. For 40 years, it was bullshit. And it's getting worse and worse now, and it's getting more and more possible. But it's still bullshit from my point of view. And if we didn't talk about Zemmour and Le Pen right now, they wouldn't exist. They'd still get they're 10% of racists voting, of hardcore racists voting for them, but the rest would vote for something else. And the problem as well is if you kind of like the focus on Zemmour, on Le Pen as well, and on seeing them as well as the only racist prevents us from looking at systemic racism in France as well at the same time. So it's like, don't vote for the extreme right, vote for the center right or center left because we're not the extreme right. Yeah, but you're still part of a very, oppressive and racist system and all of these kind of things. I mean, it's, that's what my co-author and I called reactionary democracy in a way. It's this idea that actually, you're kind of hijacking democracy for reactionary ends, and you're using democratic tropes and democratic symbols and signifiers to push reactionary ideas that are completely undemocratic. And I think that's the problem nowadays is our democracies are only democracies by name, but really not by any kind of real meaning.
I have to say, I think that the kind of runoff system does seem like a really big problem in all of this, because it allows whoever's against a Le Pen or a Zemmour to kind of just claim that they're completely different when in some respects they're actually not. Aurelien, that's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Where can people find your work?
Well, you can find my work by Googling me, I guess. That's the first and easiest way. But otherwise, I mean, a lot of what I've discussed here is really kind of compiled in a book that was released last year, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, called Reactionary Democracy, with co-written with Aaron Winter as well, which is you can find on the Verso website, and it's cheaper than on Amazon. So go to the Verso website.
Great. Thank you very much, Aurelien.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.